10 years ago, if you said indigenous knowledge at the Land Trust Alliance's annual National Land Conservation Conference, chances are you'd get blank stares. This year, there were packed breakout sessions touching on the subject throughout the 3-day conference. What's old is new again. Finally, says Dr. Ken Lucera, Zia Pueblo, the Director of Tribal and Indigenous Lands for the Trust for Public Land.
So there's been, I think, a growing movement and more willingness to understand and work with tribal communities and learn more about how they steward the lands.
Growing too are the ranks of indigenous conservation leaders. A decade ago, there was but a handful of native-led land trusts. Today, there are more than 30, with a dozen being formed just in the last 3 years. The trend caught the eye of Jessaray Growing Thunder, Fort Peck Tribes, the director of Tribal Nations Initiatives for Native Americans in Philanthropy.
Indigenous peoples have always been the first stewards of our landscapes. And I think we're in a really pivotal moment right now where a lot of the larger conservation networks and groups are starting to really recognize and appreciate the value added of collaborating and partnering with Indigenous-led conservation and environmental initiatives.
And there's also a growing awareness of the efficacy of placing indigenous knowledge, values, and leadership at the very center of conservation work.
Western science is not the only answer.
We've been leading this work for time immemorial. This work has never stopped. We've always been conservationists. And I think that should always be the gold standard. It should always be Indigenous-led.
I think best case scenario is when we can do what we would consider a true land return project, in which we acquire lands that we turn over to a tribal community that were once their ancestral lands, and we do it without restrictions.
That's already happening in many places, especially in Maine. There, the First Light Consortium of Western land conservationists has built a sturdy partnership with the Wabanaki Commission on Land and Stewardship, made up of members from each tribe in the state, that sets the conservation agenda. The model, Western conservationists coalescing behind indigenous leadership, is spreading.
The Wabanaki Commission on Land and Stewardship is our North Star.
Annalisa Victory, Cherokee, works on the Coalition of Oregon Land Trust's Land Justice Project. Oregon conservationists have learned from the work in Maine.
We have definitely partnered with them to create what we do with the Oregon Land Justice Project. We've used parts of their models, and then we've adapted it to Oregon.
The Maine model starts with First Light learning journeys for Westerners. They are 2-year immersions into the indigenous worldview and an invaluable jumping-off point.
It's only within the last, I would say, 6-7 years that a lot of momentum has been made. And in particular with our partner, First Light in Maine, for kind of being that original model.
Tom Duffus took part in First Light's first learning journey in Maine nearly a decade ago.
It was a firsthand experience of building trust, learning to listen and learned. For me, it was a life-changing experience, viewing the world from a very different perspective. And I've carried that work into my land conservation work.
And carrying that work is invaluable, says Rika Ayotte, the executive director of Oregon's Deschutes Land Trust.
A lot of organizations don't spend the time on the front end really understanding those cultural differences, those communication styles, those work styles, those sort of core beliefs. And if you don't understand that, it's really hard to build trust when you're already starting that far apart.
You can only work at the speed of trust, so it takes time. And what the First Light learning journey did was create that first really big initial step. And frankly, it was the European people that, like myself, that had to do the learning and do the hard work.
Hard work that gets results, says scholar Darren Ranko, a Penobscot citizen and member of the Wabanaki Land and Stewardship Commission.
First Light represents a huge shift for the conservation community. It is extremely special. I have not seen anything like it nationally. You know, a part of First Light is the learning journey. It's like, right, unlearning the old tools or the old ways of the environmental groups, the conservation groups, and charting this path for a different kind of future that centers not only just includes Indigenous people. I think that's sometimes where we go wrong. It's like we're going to add in a little of Indigenous to otherwise conservation work. It really needs to center Indigenous people, center Indigenous caretaking. When Indigenous people are at the forefront, are in the leadership, that's actually producing the most profound conservation outcomes around the world.
For ICT from Cleveland, I'm Stuart Huntington.